Good morning, everybody. I'll try and weave architecture and digital into this. I took the title and I've sort of merged it slightly. So transport infrastructure drive urban and social redevelopment. I suppose the first thing is, what do we think about transport infrastructure? And the Romans were quite good at this. Then we started with canals, railways, and motorways. And what was this about was either moving armies or people or goods or trade. Less of the armies today, but certainly moving people and moving goods is fundamental to this country. Inevitably, with my experience and the decades I've been involved with this, thank you, Anthony, to remind me about that, I have had a more of a focus on major projects. So I'm going to probably stick with that. But that's not to say that smaller projects at a local level can't make massive changes at that level as well. And inevitably we come to high-speed 1, Crossrail 1, high-speed 2, Crossrail 2. These will go on for decades, no doubt. But the opportunities that these kind of projects create, I think, in terms of urban and social development, are enormous. A bit about the context of today, where the UK is. You're all familiar with this. And again, from a London perspective, I'll probably focus a bit on London because that's where I am, where I work. Population growth, housing shortage. Crossrail 2 is now known as a housing project rather than a rail project, for instance. Fiscal constraint and devolution. I'm not going to go into these in details, but this is the context we're working in. And at the same time, growth in cities, and it's not just London, it's all cities, and a demand for rail and other infrastructure, which we see. And of course, with my job, I'm pleased that that's the case. And inevitably, the rebalance of the economy, which hasn't left us yet. The conversations are still there. And yet there is money out there to invest. It's just releasing that investment, I think. I borrowed this from the GLA. You'll be familiar with the contents. These are some of the, if you like, the sort of social drivers behind the scene. And you'll see in there all things to do with housing, digital schools, health, well-being, connectivity, and so on. So those give us a broad context about what we're looking at in our work today. So why transport infrastructure? And I'm doing the why, what, how thing, because I quite like the way that sets itself. There's a matter of need. National, regional, local, and that's all around us. Aging, decrepit infrastructure needs modernizing and renewal, and new developments, new technology. We need to do some more work on this. And there's a matter of scale, which I touched upon. Yes, there's the national scale with the big schemes. There's the regional scale with the smaller schemes, and actually things at local scale. You can do some very small things incrementally at a local scale and make a huge difference from that infrastructure. Connectivity and mobility. We have a very flexible labour force and people in this country compared with others. We need to encourage that. At the moment, it's quite difficult with the southeast sort of weighing down the rest of the UK, perhaps at the cost of the north, and hence the northern powerhouse to rebalance that. A low-carbon economy, which I'm sure some of the other speakers will touch on more knowledgeably than me, and looking for an investment for the future. This is for our children's children, not just us, because infrastructure lasts a long time. Just on touching on the urban and social development, and the need comes from people and communities. It's not just about government saying things, it is actually listening to what people want. And whilst as engineers and planners and contractors and so on, we'd just like to do these things, politics is involved and we cannot escape that. And the policy has to come from the needs of people. So we have to respect that and move on. And I would say, because the title sort of hinted to this, that what we do is not about social engineering or urban engineering and telling people what to do. So I'm going to focus on transport interchanges very briefly. I think it said before, I thoroughly believe that transport interchanges are catalysts for regeneration, undoubtedly, and I'll explain that a bit more. They certainly create opportunities way beyond where they are, and it's just recognizing those opportunities for all people, and examples will follow. And they also help to release potential that might not have been there before. And King's Cross, you'll see a picture there, derelict lands for decades, If you go there today, it's a totally different place. The potential has thoroughly been released, in my view. I've borrowed this little chart, which we've adapted slightly from some colleagues at Deloitte Real Estate. And this is looking at headline office rents in London for a number of different sub-markets. And whilst it goes through political and economic cycles, we've picked out Victoria, King's Cross, Paddington, the South Bank and Canary Wharf. Interestingly, Canary Wharf is quite flat. The end of the scale is quarters rather than years. But what we're seeing, we believe, is when these major project and interchanges get consented and start moving forward, you do see an increase in value appearing at that point. And interestingly, at King's Cross, the acceleration of rental values in King's Cross as buildings have come on the market has been absolutely phenomenal, as you can see from this point here. So to us, that's an indication that you can release value and potential very quickly. The next one is the flow of people, and inevitably with big interchanges, you get thousands of people a day flowing through spaces. They either work nearby or they're traveling, and actually there are opportunities for all sorts of other things with that flow of people in terms of revenue and retail and all sorts of other culture and sport and entertainment, and we can't forget that. The quality and equality part is going back to the social engineering. We have to be careful that doing these things, we don't disadvantage the communities that are there at the moment. So it's, in my view, essential that we look after what's there, we regenerate it, but we don't lose it. We don't move people away and let Russian oligarchs and others come in to take the place, if you like. The last point of that one is looking at the core, adjacent and wider areas. Quite often with these interchanges, there's quite a tight red line. And actually what happens is beyond the red line, the fuzzy boundary, is where the change can happen. So we're very keen on pursuing the idea of looking at the adjacent area and the wider area, because there are some schemes where you look at that and things have not happened and communities have not benefited from what's being done. I had to put this up because I was involved with King's Cross, and I've mentioned King's Cross. The change at King's Cross has been absolutely phenomenal. In a way, this is about the quality and the delivery of infrastructure in this country, that we can do quality work that does answer the things for the travelling public and local communities. And to me, this kind of thing is part of the catalyst, because people will want to go there. If you went to King's Cross 15 years ago, you wouldn't go in the dark, and you'd probably barely go in there today. It's an utterly different environment now, and great fun. So my last slide is about how we might do this. The investment in transport infrastructure and interchanges is there, and that's a government policy, and we of course applaud that. But we do need to form a wider vision of where these things are. You can't just plonk them in the middle of a town or city and ignore what's around it. I think by creating an environment that encourages wider investment, and actually that's from the private sector and others, you see this upwelling of potential. The catalyst to me is about coalescing the willing, and there are many willing people here. So if you have the vision, you can bring people together from across a political and social range. And clearly, actually, government policy and local policies, creating jobs and homes is what this is about as well, and taking that as an advantage. And ultimately, building sustainable communities and threading them back into the cities or towns that they've come from. So I believe we do have the evidence. I think there is belief this can happen. What's essential is leadership, and whether that's political leadership, engineering leadership, design leadership, economic leadership. Where there isn't leadership, these things fall apart. And just to show we can do this, and you might have your own views, that's Stratford on the top right and King's Cross on the bottom left. Stratford, one of the best connected places in the country. There are people saying Old Oak Common is the next one of those. And King's Cross itself, which is, of course, slightly more dear to my heart, having been involved in there in a number of ways. And these projects around transport interchanges and transport infrastructure are, I think, helping with social and urban development in a positive sense. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew.
John, I get what you're saying about Crossrail being a housing project now, but I suppose one of the key things that I was mulling over, I suppose you talk about using transport schemes to drive value. But I suppose it's value to who? How do we make sure that when you are creating a housing project, you're creating a housing project which is actually good for the local community, not just good for Russian billionaires?
I think that goes back to my point about equality and perhaps through policy. And the danger is that you can do these adjacent redevelopments. You move people out to somewhere where they don't belong, they've never belonged, that's not where their homes are. So I do think there are some policy enforcements that have to happen, not just with affordable housing, but with social housing, which we've lost in this country. When I first started my career, I was involved with a lot of social housing in Camden, Lewisham, Lambeth and places like that. It fell off the edge. London, particularly, is virtually unaffordable for a lot of people, and we have to change that. Otherwise, we're going to lose the talent of a workforce that's here, and they will leave and go somewhere else.
You're seeing that happening at King's Cross, then, are you? I mean, that is, we are creating communities there rather than just empty houses.
Absolutely. It was interesting. In my decades of work that you reminded me on before, I did work on a project just north of the King's Cross station area, which is now being redeveloped by Camden, and they're knocking the buildings I designed when I was a young graduate. But that's Camden doing that and seeing the opportunities that are created around them with the student housing, with the University of the Arts for London, with Camden Town Hall, Google going there. I mean, what a magnet that is. So if you get the balance right, then I think you get communities working in a better way in the future.
Anyone want to put a quick point to John before he legs it off? Yeah, hang on.
Concur with you about King's Cross. I think it's fantastic, and it's one of those projects that I know a lot of lay people who aren't in the construction industry, and they love it. And when I stay in London now, I stay in a bed and breakfast opposite St Pancras Station, and it's very safe at night.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do that 15 years ago.
No, not a hope.
Thanks very much, John. One final thing, just to segue into our next talk is, I mean, do you think that we hear a lot about, the future is about designing and building apps rather than buildings? Is that true?
I think apps can certainly help with the building of buildings, and I think we're not yet taking full advantage of some of the technology around across the piece. Lots of talk about off-site manufacture, pre-assembly. Have we made it yet? Not quite. Again, in the 80s, I was involved in a lot of that work, and we got to a point where the quality of what we did in dry conditions and assembled on site, then we've fallen off a little bit. In terms of the technology and the use of apps, actually, where I see that might be coming in is from the users providing information before we actually start building things. And people are so connected that we could go out and get information that we just assume we know because we're professionals. We must know the right answers. Clearly we don't, and actually talking to the communities will feedback, and that happens often with stakeholder management. But I think technology could release a lot of that flow in a way that we haven't done before.
John, thank you very much. Round of applause, John Turzynski.
Thank you.
From Arup.